Hello everyone, today we read and comment the first chapter of the third book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. It may sound strange, but for all who know war in this respect, it is a fact beyond doubt that much more strength of will is required to make an important decision in strategy than in tactics. In the latter, we are hurried on with the moment. A commander feels himself borne along in a strong current against which he durst not contend without the most destructive consequences. He supposes the rising fears and boldly ventures further. In strategy, where all goes on at a slower rate, there is more room allowed for our own apprehensions and those of others, for objections and remonstrances, consequently also for unseasonable regrets. And as we do not see things in strategy as we do at least half of them in tactics, with the leading eye, but everything must be conjectured and assumed, the convictions produced are less powerful. The consequence is that most generals, when they should act, remain stuck fast in bewildering doubts. Now let us cast a glance at history, upon Frederick the Great's campaign of 1760, celebrated for its fine marches and maneuvers. A perfect masterpiece of strategic skill, as critics tell us. Is there really anything to drive us out of our wits with admiration in the king's first trying to turn Daun's right flank, then his left, then again his right, etc.? Are we to see profound wisdom in this? No, that we cannot, if we are to decide naturally and without affectation. What we rather admire above all is the sagacity of the king in this respect, that while pursuing a great object with very limited means, he undertook nothing beyond his powers and just enough to gain his object. This sagacity of the general is visible not only in this campaign, but throughout all three wars of the great king. To bring Silesia into the safe harbor of a well-guaranteed peace was his object. At the head of a small state, which was like other states in most things, and only ahead of them in some branches of administration, he could not be an Alexander, and as Charles XII, he would only, like him, have broken his head. We find therefore in the whole of his conduct of war a controlled power, always well balanced and never wanting in energy, which in the most critical moments rises to astonishing deeds, and the next moment oscillates quietly on again in subordination to the play of the most subtle political influences. Neither vanity, thirst for glory, nor vengeance could make him deviate from his course, and this course alone it is which brought him to a fortunate termination of the contest. These few words do but scant justice to this phase of the genius of the great general. The eyes must be fixed carefully on the extraordinary issue of the struggle, and the causes which brought about that issue must be traced out, in order thoroughly to understand that nothing but the king's penetrating eye brought him safely out of all his dangers. This is one feature in this great commander which we admire in the campaign of 1760, and in all others, but in this especially, because in none did he keep the balance even against such a superior hostile force with such a small sacrifice. Another feature relates to the difficulty of execution. Marches to turn a flank, right or left, are easily combined. The idea of keeping a small force always well concentrated to be able to meet the enemy on equal terms at any point, to multiply a force by rapid movement, is as easily conceived as expressed. The mere contrivance in these points, therefore, cannot excite our admiration, and with respect to such simple things there is nothing further than to admit that they are simple. But let a general try to do these things like Frederick the Great. Long afterwards authors who were eyewitness have spoken of the danger, indeed of the imprudence of the king's camps, and doubtless at the time he pitched them the danger appeared 3 times as great as afterwards. It was the same with his marches, under the eyes, nay, often under the cannon of the enemy's army. These camps were taken up, these marches made, not from want of prudence, but because in Daun's system in his mode of drawing up his army, in the responsibility which pressed upon him, and in his character, Frederick found that security which justified his camps and marches. But it required the king's boldness, determination, and strength of will to see things in this light, not to be led astray and intimidated by the danger of which 30 years after people still wrote and spoke. Few generals in this situation would have believed these simple strategic means to be practicable. Again, another difficulty in execution lay in this, that the king's army in this campaign was constantly in motion. Twice it marched by wretched cross-roads from the Elbe into Silesia, in rear of Daun and pursued by Lacy, beginning of July, beginning of August. It required to be always ready for battle, and its marches had to be organized with a degree of skill which necessarily called for a proportionate amount of exertion. Although attended and delayed by thousands of wagons, still its subsistence was extremely difficult. In Silesia, for 8 days before the Battle of Liegnitz, it had consistently to march, defiling alternately right and left in front of the enemy. This costs great fatigue and entails great privations. Is it to be supposed that all this could have been done without producing great friction in the machine? Can the mind of a commander elaborate such movements with the same ease as the hand of a land surveyor uses the astrolabe? Does not the sight of the sufferings of their hungry, thirsty comrades pierce the hearts of the commander and his generals 1,000 times? Must not the murmurs and doubts which these cause reach his ear? Has an ordinary man the courage to demand such sacrifices, and would not such a force more certainly demoralize the army, break up the bands of discipline, and in short undermine its military virtue, if firm reliance on the greatness and infallibility of the commander did not compensate for all? Here, therefore, it is that we should pay respect. It is these miracles of execution which we should admire. But it is impossible to realize all this in its full force without a foretaste of it by experience. He who only knows war from books or the drill ground cannot realize the whole effect of this counterpoise in action. We beg him, therefore, to accept from us on faith and trust all that he is unable to supply from any personal experiences of his own. This illustration is intended to give more clearness to the course of our ideas, and in closing this chapter we will only briefly observe that in our exposition of strategy we shall describe those separate subjects which appear to us the most important, whether a moral or material nature, then proceed from the simple to complex and conclude with the inner connection of the whole act of war, in other words, with the plan for a war or campaign. So in this passage, von Clausewitz highlights the true value that exists in strategic choices, aside from the mere, strictly operational deal, right? That is, what maneuver can I do against the enemy, how that's going to be considered. Everything in strategy tends to be simpler. We have seen this in the previous books, in the sense that, of course, since the thing is enormously difficult in itself, it has to be narrowed down to simple choices. To actions that turn out objectively to be simple in outline, that naturally are built by lots of other sub-actions that altogether make up a very complicated thing. But essentially, there is not an enormous deal of creativity that stems from the most general plans in strategy. Those remain essentially simple in their nature. And what we should appreciate in this regard, von Clausewitz says, is not much, in fact, their sophistication, which actually in war goes against the principle of simplicity, right? A unity of command, and it creates problems just from a sheer physical point of view, but rather the strength of will, the determination, the courage that takes to perform them, right, and keep leading the operation in spite of all these sufferings and risks and complaints and other aspects that are dramatically overlooked, I think, in popular culture when we come to talk about wars, we generally say, those generals that never, those old people that send, the young to die, and they don't know how it is, right, or whatever. Von Clausewitz flips the thing completely. Really, it's commanders that bear more than everybody else actually the burden of the action, because they are going to be overwhelmed by the sense of responsibility, by this continuous pressure that is effectively what is largely going to make the difference in a clash that is a clash between moral forces, right, by definition, and that therefore cannot be let's say observed like just a pure act of rationality, of intelligence, but a combination of a lot of other moral forces involved that obviously have to do also with the ability of seeing through what you have around, which is extremely difficult, and it is what your decisions are going to be based on, but it also that necessarily and most importantly must have determination to follow, to translate in action, in spite of all the attrition, all what rose backwards compared to what you do. And von Clausewitz writes, it may sound strange, but for all who know war in this respect, it is a fact beyond doubt that much more strength and will is required to make an important decision in strategy than in tactics, right? It may sound strange. Von Clausewitz says it, this is counterintuitive in many ways, but paradoxically, it's much more, it's much heavier to take a strategic decision than a tactical one. You would say, well, when you're in battle, it's much tougher, right? Because we're being made us believe to think that after all, war is just what happens on the battlefield in combat, and that's all what war is about that distinguishes from the rest, as if there was a barrier. This is a very distorted view of what warfare is in the first place, and paradoxically it's much easier for many reasons actually, for physical and moral reasons alike. And when I say physical, strictly I'm talking about physics proper, but also as a system, they are simpler systems than tactical ones. But also, and paradoxically, it takes less or however cheaper moral forces to deal with a tactical decision than with a strategic one. Right? And once again, von Clausewitz says it may sound strange, but so it is, and we have seen in the past why, and then now we expand a little. Von Clausewitz writes, in the latter we are hurried on with the moment, right? So in battle, what really is driving the whole thing is what is going on at the moment, right? It often happens this is very relatable also in real life. Think about all the doubts that you may have, I don't know, before you have to make an exam or a competition or something that will eventually last a few times, right? And that you prepare, however, for a very long time. And what happens when you actually deal with the thing is much easier, all in all, right? We compared, and also much less demanding morally and physically than what it did in all the time that you have been preparing for it. After all, in fact, there is this kind of sense of relief even. In this sense, this even explains why fighting for humans also in itself is not such an enormous deal. Humans can adapt to it relatively easily. Von Clausewitz says, a commander feels himself borne along in a strong current against which he durst not contend without the most destructive consequences. He suppresses the rising fears and boldly ventures further. This is a very refined realization. Von Clausewitz has been through all this stuff. He knows this by first person, And in point, it's true, right? We are while you're fighting and you're dealing with a situation that evolves very quickly, also in front of your eyes, because that's what a tactical engagement, but not entirely, but largely, you're in there. You see, you're kind of more aware of what is going on than in strategy, in proportion, and you are fundamentally responding to what happens contingentally. Right, the enemy is attacking on the left. Fight, okay, concentrate troops there. Keep an eye from the other side. Keep control. Start assessing about what's the fire. Or, odds are going like in this context, and all those things that are also kind of very empirical and even instinctive in some ways to understand. I don't know if you started to listen to this series from this video. Maybe it may sound strange if you have not been acquainted with why von Clausewitz is saying these things, by the way, if you don't listen to what he said before. Right? As I always say, the Vom Kriege should be studied from the beginning to the end, not even read, right? Because otherwise it doesn't make sense. This is not a book you can cherry pick stuff just for cheap quotes and showing off. This is a system that works with all its parts, and at the same time. And you're so, and Foucault is saying you're so committed to this most evident and even in combat, all these great forces that are brought, strategically speaking, to fight are burning out very quickly. Right, this whole thing unfolds in combat very, very quickly, right, and therefore you're overwhelmed largely by this, right? It's what they said also soldiers in many contexts, even about World War I, that World War I veterans simply said, as many others, like the deal, combat was relatively fine. Because you were boosted with adrenaline and you went out there and you had things to do, that kept your mind busy. What I really couldn't stand was the waiting, right? Waiting for entire days before the attack that is psychologically devastating, right? Much more than actually killing a person in front of you when you're in the heat of battle as such. And naturally, this is valid also for the consequences of this, because of course, what happens in combat has consequences in this sense also for afterwards. It doesn't go right, but at the moment, so when you're taking that tactical decision, the thing after all unfolds fairly easily. At least it comes natural to be there to do it, right? There would be many important kind of in anthropological considerations we could do for this, also relatively to what the nature of combat actually is for mankind, but this is another issue. And so you can suppress your fears, right? You boldly venture further, fundamentally on the base of what your forces and the ones of the enemy are doing, right? And also tactics, as we have seen from the same Vom Kriege, is much easier to understand, right? Even if every fight is different, there's never been in history a single army, a single soldier that's been alike to another, and therefore we can imagine even a battle that unfolded in the same way. That it doesn't exist, a typical battle in the sense that it was replicated. But the essentials of tactics are easy to understand. So what von Clausewitz is saying here is that after all, the thing is fairly manageable. There would be a lot to say also about the fog of war in this context, because of course not everything that happens in a battle is really under control, right? Tactics is not intelligible. It's just it's not immune from the difficulties we have in framing the whole thing, how it's going on. But in the essentials, it's more dominable, like more easily interpretable than strategy, especially in and also in expectation in some way. Then von Clausewitz says, in strategy, where all goes at a slower rate, there is more room allowed for our own apprehensions, and those of others for objection and remonstrances, consequently also for unseasonable regrets. And as we do not see things in strategy, as we do at least half of them in tactics, with the living eye, but everything must be conjectured and assumed, the convictions produced are less powerful. This is very important, right? He is telling us that strategy has in itself this largely, this constantly, if you want, hypothetic, this higher, say better, hypothetic character. Because everything that happens is much less easily frameable compared to the evidence of what is going on in a battle, right? And not only, but it also elongates in time, so that and the time of taking decision, of course, is also generally longer. It leaves you exposed to more problems, to more opinions, to more doubts, because this is the point, as we will see now, and therefore it's all more difficult, right? It is difficult to take a strategic decision, much more difficult than taking a tactical one. This has nothing to do with feeling that, I don't know, being under shell fire, you have more difficulties to take that action, right? Because paradoxically, that pushes you to be more direct in whatever thing is going on there. If you're not even in there under excessive stress, in the sense that, of course, even the generals on the field can freak out because they don't know what to do. But in strategy, the degree of immediacy, also in taking this decision, is drastically reduced, because there is much greater exposure to all those problems that are constantly presenting, sometimes even uselessly, right? There is always someone who's gonna be kind of doubtful about your opinion, is criticizing it, that is instilling doubt, and you don't have realistically much possibility to confirm whether the theory is right or not. So it requires an enormous effort, right, that can't solve the thing, as always. Not even by the majority of things should be known, but that in this sense is burdened by this constant doubt. Von Clausewitz writes, in fact, the consequence is that most generals, when they should act, remain stuck fast in bewildering doubts. This is the greater problem of all, right? That if you take a decision in strategy, you're really going to cause much greater consequences, and this naturally brings everything around you to take a different form, a different approach, to be animated by different voices, by different factors that you're just a single individual that is exposed to this, even if just in indirectly in some ways, but to all the possibilities that open to you in your mind that are naturally very difficult to prove at every moment. How many times you did something that you thought was fairly well planned, and eventually turned out to be wrong, or at least that you had an afterthought, and then you realized actually that the first idea was right, and that you did wrong at changing that. Well, von Clausewitz has already said in the Vom Kriege, if you remember, that paradoxically, even if you make a mistake, sometimes it's better still not to come back and start from. First of all, you can't do it most of the time. But secondly, if you really set your track in a certain direction, you shouldn't, even if it was a mistake, it's preferable on average to keep on that, go on that trail, making the best you can to fix the situation along the way, but not wasting this time, not if you don't have proof, naturally, that's how we put it, actually, that what you're doing is still appearing to be, wrong, keep doing that, right? That's the ultimate thing. Even if there are lots of people who tell you don't do it, but you had this intuition, and you think on your base that there is not enough proof to say that this thing is wrong, and you actually think it's right, just go on with that way. Because even if you're wrong, that's still better for the whole thing. And doubt can really be much more disruptive by itself, rather than even a mistake when it happens and when you have realized it. And we all know this, right? We all fear things before they happen, and eventually they happen. You realize that you could have done better, but still you went through that, and you appreciate the way you did and what was already functioning, right? To be I mean, for good. And this is in perspective also a problem when we tend to think of the past sometimes, and past action in kind of a pinker way that they actually were. That we think, if I only had been there, for example, at that point. Yeah, but at that point you didn't quite know how a lot of other things were. So you should contextualize. Of course, with what you know now, you would do better. You would have done better in the past. But still, you had to learn that very often the hard way in this regard. So this is very didactic. And then von Clausewitz basically talks about the campaign, Frederick the Great's campaign of 1760, that he takes as this greatest example of this determination, right, of this capacity of carrying out a fairly simple strategical task, right, but that required, however, an enormous amount of moral force, right, of strength of will, right, and self-control and everything. So once again, strategy is not something that is good if it's hyper sophisticated. Some of the most hyper sophisticated plans, historically speaking, have failed, right? Look at the Persian invasion of Greece or the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Those were great plans, but they were somewhat, being mistaken about something that was more important after all than the sophistication in itself. Think about the Schlieffen plan at the same time. It was ultra complicated, and the first thing that happened, for example, that it jumped since the beginning, because already, for example, I don't know, Italy was out of the German-Austro-Hungarian alliance at that point. The whole thing was, the timeline, the time schedule jumped for many other reasons, and the Schlieffen plan actually was destined probably to fail, even if it had been enacted properly, right? So lots of examples of this kind of difficulty that also can be undertaken, as von Clausewitz puts out here, only when you are in the condition of being, a great empire, right? Not just when you're a modest power, like objectively, as he recognized as a Prussian in the 1830s, that Prussia was in the 1760s. He even talks in these terms about Charles XII, Sweden against Russia, and so on. And in fact, he says, now let us cast a glance at history upon Frederick the Great's campaign of 1760, celebrated for its fine marches. We are in the 7 Years' War, if you're contextually speaking. Marches and maneuvers. A perfect masterpiece of strategic skill, as critics tell us. Is there really anything to drive us out of our wits with admiration in the king's first trying to turn Daun's right flank, then his left, then again his right, etc.? Are we to see profound wisdom in this? Not that we cannot, if we are to decide it naturally and without affectation. I mean, what's objectively the strategic intelligence of saying, I'll try now to turn the enemy's flank? I mean, it's one of the most elementary strategic principles that, are so banal to understand at every level, right? Right. So what's the deal here? It is that Frederick thought to do it, or is it that he did it, and with an enormous difficulty in this regard? Because, lots of things, especially from a moral point of view, always remember that for Clausewitz, war is primarily a clash between moral forces. Material things come later. Always remember this, right? Don't think about weapons, don't think about technology. Those are literally the least important things in warfare ever. Ever. And they will always remain, right? It's all about moral forces. So for von Clausewitz, the matter is very simple. No, there wasn't any specific greatness in Frederick's idea of, carrying out those maneuvers, right, in conceiving it. And he writes, what we rather admire, above all, is the sagacity of the king in this respect, that while pursuing a great object with very limited means, he undertook nothing beyond his powers, and just enough to gain his object. This means a lot. This is a principle, it's an economic principle, right? You don't need to overexert your forces, right? You have to do in life, not just in war, what it takes that to just enough gain your object. Because that's it. The least effort with a greater result, right? Not that this didn't have a big cost, but it could have been greater if the thing had been lost the focus of what the deal in warfare really is. And von Clausewitz then writes that this sagacity of the general is visible not only in this campaign, but throughout all the 3 wars of the great king. Okay. To bring Silesia into the safe harbor of a well-guaranteed peace was his object, right? That was the great deal, the Prussian-Austrian, let's call it theater, right, of the 7 Years' War, right? To seize Silesia, reaching mines and important territory in the midst of between the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollern. First invading Saxony, then passing to Silesia. It was the usual Prussian move, and the Austrians obviously reacting to it. And then von Clausewitz goes on and says, at the head of a small state, which was like other states in most things, and only ahead of them in some branches of administration, right? He's talking about Prussia at the time of Frederick the Great. He says, Prussia had throughout this time a big deal of political, administrative, fiscal reforms that are the ones that comprehensively allowed Prussia, the Hohenzollern, to have the army that eventually they had. So much they said that not Prussia had an army, but the Prussian state had an army, but the Prussian army had a state. That was the phrase, the hyper-discipline of Prussian troops that was famous from the 18th century onwards, but it was still a fairly modest state. Yeah, we can say that it was a middle power, medium power, right? It wasn't like a large power yet. And the risk actually consistently, think about the miracles of the House of Brandenburg, to be wiped out in this very contexts. And yet, von Clausewitz, he's praising here the fact that exactly for this awareness, that Frederick's awareness of not being part of a, not having an empire, not having infinite resources, right, calibrating the wants of a medium power. He says he could not be an Alexander, and as Charles the 12th, that also had not such a small power, telling the truth at his time, he would only, like him, have broken his head, right? So if what von Clausewitz is saying here is that you always have to take your strategic choices, decisions, by considering realistically, naturally, what your forces are, right? Not just to say, okay, I have to squeeze them all, right? It's wrong. It's even damaging to give more than you can, especially in a if everything naturally is calibrated on the objective, right, on the means and the ends as such, but you still have to think about the future, and you still have to foretell, which is very difficult naturally, basically impossible beyond some months, what could happen next, right? So the mind is set always on that. This is typical of human history in general. All great powers, small powers, medium powers have always reasoned in relatively short terms, when talking about military stuff specifically, right? The same true for politics, right? But that's a thing we're not going to discuss because it's more complicated. But let's say that we objectively don't know what will happen in 4 months in this world. There's no way to predict it correctly. And that's also why we must take this strategic, this information for our strategic ends. That is to say, we can't plan something that will happen 1 year if you don't know even how this strategic theater is going to evolve in 4 months. Because we could simply be mistaken, and we could spend 3 times what we would have done for 4 months, in fact, and for no reason, and losing what we would have needed in that other time, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, "We find therefore in the whole of his conduct of war a controlled power always well balanced and never wanting in energy, which is the most critical. In the most critical moments rises to astonishing deeds, and the next moment oscillates quietly and again in subordination to the play of the most subtle political influences." So this is also what more realistically happens within that time in which strategy reasons like during the campaign, the time frame. That is, there is a moment, as we've seen in previous books, in which the war gets unleashed proper in all its strength that usually comes to the battle itself, in this moment in which requires this kind of interruptions, even the suspensions of the military actions, such as stopping for camp or something, right? Naturally, we're reasoning always by extremes, right? So the suspension is never true, never ends. War never ends, right? There is not a moment after peace in which war ends. What does it even means, right? These are all asymptotical principles, but the idea is that at some point war intensifies, and then it has necessarily, because of economy of forces, to come back oscillating quietly, right? And always not just being influenced by war, but by the political subordination, right? Or better, the subordination to politics properly of war itself. So there is no need to always be at the top, right? You would exhaust yourself. How do fights work, right? Everything is calibrated to be as fresh as possible at the moment of combat, right? It's not a race for getting, doing the strongest thing, because you would be exhausted. You would simply use all your force and leaving your intelligence alone without other resources to be destroyed eventually by someone who has calibrated these forces in a more intelligent way, right? It's really that simple. And von Clausewitz says, "Then neither vanity, thirst for glory, nor vengeance could make him deviate." We're talking always about Frederick, "from his course, and this course alone it is which brought him to a fortunate termination of the contest." So the merit of Frederick's success was merely this wise use of its own resource, right? Not this, brutal, direction, or even hyper sophisticated. No, just going step by step, gradually, calibrating well the situation and doing just enough to obtain the result. And von Clausewitz goes on and says, "And these few words do but scant justice to this phase of the genius of the great general. The eyes must be fixed carefully on the extraordinary issue of the struggle, and the causes which brought about that issue must be traced out, in order thoroughly to understand that nothing but the king's penetrating eye brought him safely out of all dangers." Right? So naturally, the picture is way more complicated than this. The economy of forces is fundamental, because without that you couldn't go anyway. But also what is going on, and that has at that point even an equally important but derived important role, is this capacity of realizing what is going on and being capable of districating yourself through very perilous waters in this regard. And that's also where the mind of a great general is tested as such. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, "This is one feature in this great commander which we admire in the campaign of 1760 and in all others, but in this especially, because in none did he keep the balance even against such a superior style force with such a small sacrifice." Right? So the merit also of a military action, this is very important to understand also in military history as such. It's not just, how, big the accomplishments are, right? There are certain military operations that are masterpieces, and it's obvious, even if they are somewhat simple and they appear as such with smaller powers, or even smaller armies. And naturally, there is another factor, that is, the larger the system is, the more complicated it comes to rule it, and the more imposing comes the burden to obtain some. So, of course, that will count. But at the same time, there is a ratio between, in fact, the danger and what you're doing, that it can be really multiplied compared to many other situations in which, after all, yes, the thing could be a big deal, the world enterprise could be a big deal, but still, maybe the odds were more favorable, or at least there was a different situation. Here, Frederick managed to win against superior rivals in a situation that was definitely very difficult, and not at all, so predictable, of course, but also that didn't favor particularly the Prussians, given the odds, right? And what is interesting is also how you can realize the results on the base of the efforts that you made. Von Clausewitz writes, "Another feature relates to the difficulty of execution. Marches to turn a flank, right or left, are easily combined. The idea of keeping a small force always well concentrated to be able to meet the enemy on equal terms at any point, to multiply a force by rapid movement, is easily conceived and expressed. The mere contrivance in these points therefore cannot excite our admiration, and with respect to such simple things there is nothing further than to admit that they are simple." Right? That is, in the basic maneuvering, right? Making these enveloping maneuvers and in accelerating the speed, or always having this kind of satisfactory force that you can oppose to the enemy is fairly simple to achieve, right? There is nothing special in it. That's basically how all armies, under all commanders, are able to work. So, not even in here, we should appreciate much Frederick greatness, for such things. But, as von Clausewitz writes, let a general try to do these things like Frederick the Great. Long afterwards, authors who were eyewitnesses have spoken of the danger, indeed of the imprudence of the king's camps, and doubtless at the time he pitched them, the danger appeared 3 times as great as afterwards. This is also another thing that is to be understood in military history. It's not done very often, most of the times. That is to say, okay, we know how it's gone, so more or less we have an idea of what they were trying, they were expecting from each other. This is actually not true. Of course, historically speaking, there are many times in which we don't even know, for example, how many forces were deployed, things like these. But it's obvious that at the moment in which this was happening, the situation was definitely much less clear. We have seen it in the previous book, in which von Clausewitz expressed that it's much easier for the same people who took part to that action to assess only later what the thing was, right? So we can't judge a military action ex post simply by saying, oh, well, now we know all the data, so we have to reason as if, we were the guys at the time that knew how the enemies... How? The danger here appeared 3 times as great, and guess why? Because they didn't know as much, right? And still, the point is that the danger amplifies the doubts, right? So this is not once again. So von Clausewitz says every military action is taken with just 1/4 of the satisfactory data, on average, of what is needed to carry out that that action, let's say, perfectly. Which means that constantly, every single action you take, you don't know how it's going to go, even if it's a good one, right? So you can imagine, in this regard, all the risk that objectively in the 1760 campaigns occurred, right, as very simple moves, but that required such an enormous determination, because the thing could go easily wrong at a given moment. And von Clausewitz goes on, says, it was the same with his marches under the eyes, nay, often under the cannon of the enemy's army. Right? Think about how close that was, right? And how the thing could, escalate from a moment to another. These camps were taken up, these marches made not from want of prudence, but because in Daun's system, in his mode of drawing up his army, in the responsibility which pressed upon him, and in his character, Frederick found that security which justified his camps and marches. Right? So this is the coup d'oeil that Frederick the Great had for his enemy. Right? He knew from the way he moved the army, the way he arranged it, he deployed it, and how the general behavior, how far he could push this, right? He was being fed by the same enemy's behavior in this regard, right? And justified such camps and marches, even if they were so close, so dangerously close to the enemy. But in the greatness of it, as von Clausewitz points out here, it required the king's boldness, determination, and strength of will to see things in this light and not to be led astray and intimidated by the danger of which 30 years after people still wrote and spoke. Right? So the point here is that Frederick was great not because he did that type of maneuver in itself, but because he had the guts and the intelligence to understand that he could do that and do them, right? And that's the whole difference that is made. Very simple actions that anyhow definitely do not require a common individual to be accomplished, because what is simple in war is also difficult, right? Sometimes, actually, von Clausewitz says that the simplest is the most difficult thing to do. And this is the reason. And in fact, von Clausewitz writes, few generals in this situation would have believed these simple strategic means to be practicable. You see what the deal here is that the whole thing was considered strategically simple at that point. But the practicability of it, finding someone who would do that just for moral reasons, right? It was dangerous. It was seen as dangerous. An incredible risk could be done by Frederick only because he was, one, intelligent enough to know, to predict only in part, what the enemy would do, and investing in that. That was his Schwerpunkt proper. In general, of course, the thing varied as always, as the Schwerpunkt transmutes continuously. But secondly, the courage for doing that, right? If you fail here, you lose your own polity, right? Here it's not a matter of saying, oh well, it's just a game. You have an entire people to respond to for your failure. And would have gambled that, because war is essentially a gamble. It always is, right? This has nothing to do with that Frederick going there and winning because he was the best. He could easily lose. Actually, he lost on several occasions, and he was saved just by political things, right? The Russians at some point, as we know, could easily march on Berlin. But that's not the point. The point is that he made the difference by following his own capacities and achieving that in spite of the unpredictability of it. And yet that's what effectively made the difference, because eventually reality happens, and it happened in that way, right? But the whole thing cannot be fully appreciated in this regard if one does not understand the unpredictability of the whole thing as such, right? So von Clausewitz goes on and says, again, another difficulty in execution lay in this, that the king's army in this campaign was constantly in motion. Right? So here von Clausewitz focuses also on the, as we'll see now, with the complications that arose from these and how they impacted also the psychological side of the story in this all. Twice it marched by wretched crossed roads from the Elbe into Silesia in the rear of Daun, and pursued by Lacy, no, it's pronounced actually, beginning of July, beginning of August. It required to be always ready for battle, and its marches had to be organized with a degree of skill which necessarily called forth a proportionate amount of exertion. Right? Although attended and delayed by thousands of wagons, still its subsistence was extremely difficult. Right? In Silesia, for 8 days before the Battle of Liegnitz, it had constantly to march, defiling alternately right and left in front of the enemy. This costs great fatigue and entails great privations. Right? This is also another aspect that is often not considered in war, as we imagine the armored forces as such being just a tool that we can use, but they don't get tired, they don't get exhausted, they're always kind of in the same, structure under your control. It does not. Your army wears out, right? You can't maintain an army for more than a certain amount of time. It's not well supplied if it has, especially at this point, in a situation in which this campaign still followed, not necessarily a seasonal path, but still rhythm. But I mean, the concept that naturally there is a time which you have to stop the thing, because otherwise your army simply melts away, literally, right? And this would happen every time. So just think about the exertion in this regard, that all this complicated maneuvering on difficult terrain, under constant enemy threat, and in a situation where even finding resources was very difficult, how they would impact the whole moral of the story. Given that war is a clash between moral forces, this is of dramatic importance. And von Clausewitz writes, "Is it to be supposed that all this could have been done without producing great friction in the machine? Can the mind of a commander elaborate such movements with the same ease as the hand of a land surveyor uses the astrolabe?" Right? That is, do you think that taking that simple decision, that's simple because it's simple conceptually, and there's really not much about it that kind of makes sense, that is complicated at the point you're saying, it takes a genial mind to do it. But do you think it's easy to take that decision? Do you think that you will going to push those men into that, and just them obeying you, if you don't have a particular plan, if you're not sure about what you're doing, if you don't have the confidence, the charisma of even promising them that they will make it? Naturally, there is training, there is discipline, etc. These things would never also work like on pure, devotion. You have to be able to shut down people in a blink of an eye, because otherwise you can't make anything work. And that's how the thing worked at the time. And von Clausewitz then keeps questioning, does not the sight of the sufferings of their hungry, thirsty comrades pierce the hearts of the commander and his generals 1,000 times? Right? This is dramatic. right? For those who think that generals are just, smoking cigars in their headquarters and laughing and drinking champagne while soldiers die in the front, that has never been the case, historically speaking. It doesn't make the slightest sense. That's mere stupid propaganda, cheap propaganda, by the way, for specific political means. This is not to say that there were incompetent commands, that some didn't actually believe or think like that, but there was this crushing weight, and there is always, historically, in every society, in every army, in every political environment, for the responsibility that derives from the choices these people were taking. There's not the person who get away with that. I don't know, ask Churchill after Gallipoli, for example. This is an enormous deal, right? And this explains a lot, historically speaking, because the example, a depressed Churchill for Britain and the world was a much greater loss than a British soldier gunned down by an Ottoman machine gun. I mean, without any question, right? You can't be rhetorical as much as you like. That was a young human life and everything. This is not how history works for real, unfortunately, right? And not only war requires sacrifices, but it requires intelligence and discipline and competence to be attained. So what would have been the life of one of Frederick's soldiers in this situation compared to his own? The loss of his mind and his charisma and his ability. I mean, are you seriously comparing them? Of course you can't compare them. Frederick's one was much greater, no doubt. You understand how, controversial the reality is, and how far we have shifted culturally as a civilization to consider, this idealistic stereotypes and cliche. Just for what at the end of the day? Getting better? No, because seriously, because of this, many more people have died. Because much less competent people have obtained what they had to. Because of pietistic views. Right? You can't be tolerant and just getting away with that because, society, the thing has to be tolerant. And just why? Well, I don't know, we've been told so. There is a limit. Sometimes you have to be heartless in order to be human. And there is no other way to put this. And this is really the greatest achievements of human intelligence and dignity and value. Studying politics, studying war, is the only way to put this thing in perspective. And the reason why so many people don't understand this thing is because they're radically ignorant in politics, in history, in warfare, in social sciences, because they have literally no idea. Nobody has taught these things to men, and therefore they keep repeating and perpetrating this madness that actually causes sane people like them to die at the end of the day, because that's how it happens, historically speaking. Von Clausewitz says, has an ordinary man the courage to demand such sacrifices? Right? And would not such a force most certainly demoralize the army, break up the bands of discipline, and in short undermine its military virtue, if firm reliance on the greatness and infallibility of the commander did not compensate for all? Right, so can a normal person do that? I mean, would you like to be in charge of the life of thousands of people, the fate of an entire country, and paying fully the consequences of it for real? I don't think an average person would. By the way, skip this part, says, must not the murmurs and doubts which these cause reach his ears, right? And these doubts can, as we've seen before, in taking strategic decisions, that is going out there for real, right? So in a way you can't come back, because in a battle you can disengage maybe in some situations, but when you go deep into enemy territory and you're fully committed with that, if you lose a battle, it's an enormous deal because you're done for, right? But it's this greatness of the individual control and coup d'oeil and resilience and determination that we have to, as von Clausewitz says here, therefore it is what we should pay respect. It is these miracles of execution which we should admire. Right? This is really the thing that matters. That's how you evaluate a person. I think it's disgusting when we study history by becoming Puritans and pretending that we shouldn't like great figures like, I don't know, Caesar or Alexander or Napoleon, because, I don't know, they also killed a lot of people on the base of, what seems not really senseless, because in there most of the times there is a logical reason that, but just because they did that, right? Just because thinking that those were these megalomaniacal individuals and bombastic kind of obsessed that did it for the sake of itself. This is an historiographical approach that is very, very, very common in especially a half of Western world for specific cultural reasons that have developed this idea that the tyrant is the evil person, right? That all the poor innocent people pay for, right? If you look at history, most of the times people at the top were some of the most competent and intelligent and bright people you could ever have in that place, right? There's nothing to, there is no, determinism in here, right? Of course, there were many incompetent people, but generally speaking, what you see here, even in the Clausewitz, is that there's always in human hierarchies a selection, a brutal selection, for which if you got to that point, it's not because you're just a psychopath. Because guess what? People don't like to be ruled by psychopaths in general. You would say, oh, look at Hitler. Well, yeah, but there are exceptions, again. But once again, even if you look at that figure, you can't see that there was something to it. There was a fertile ground over which those ideologies also developed, right? And still, even an individual like Hitler, in his craziness, we will have to make a bit about Hitler in how, realizing how certain times he got lucky, definitely, but also got things done, right? Don't think that things like even the invasion of Poland, it's very stupid how people believe, make these jokes about World War II and say, what chances Poland had. But actually, Poland had some chances to beat the Nazis. I mean, there's no deterministic thing, and actually they played very poorly that match. And then there needed to be, because we still live in the wake of political propaganda, World War II. Like, we have to idolize certain countries and figures to accommodate the post-World War II political ideas, right? That are, of course, they were fine, right? Because it was right to celebrate Poland's resistance against the Nazis, but we can't also say that they did a good job in doing that in 1939. Objective, if you study the campaign as such, this is not a moral judgment, this is a strategic judgment. And the same goes for the invasion of France. Do you think that the Nazis now simply walked into France and defeated the French because, they had already planned that they would have won? That was an enormous gamble, right? There was no certainty whatsoever, like in old military history, always, all single times, that thing would go well, right? So even in the crazy, in the evil, there can be the greatness of an undertaking. That's why we celebrate figures that, of course, we don't know. Do you know personally who Caesar was, or who Napoleon? Maybe we know him better, of course, but of course, even Napoleon has been, has done things that are objectively very, very perplexing, because, you can't kill people for certain political goals, but it depends which those goals are in the first place, right? If you like Caesar, you massacred 300,000 Gauls at one time, and you realize that had a specific counterinsurgential reason in the broader strategic plan. of holding goal, well, you can't say, oh, well, that is just a genocidal crazy bastard because he did that. I mean, study the campaign. You will understand why he did that. As much as you will understand why there were certain tribes that had rebelled to them and that he pardoned and he kept well, and other innocent tribes had supported the Romans that were exterminated, because there was all a political balance to maintain there. That is called intelligence and civilization. It's not called craziness and, just being a martyr. Because guess what? In order to make civilization, you also kill people. What do you think the Americans bombed Japan for? I know you will always find the idiot who will say, oh no, they couldn't, it's such a terrible thing they did. Actually, they saved a lot of life. Do you know what the Japanese would have done if that? Of course, it was in the whole thing, the warning to the Soviets, there was a lot. But still, once again, even if you bring that into the equation, it's actually a pretty damn good point. Do you think you can fight Nazi fascism without killing people? What kind of scumbag are you? We have to put things in a real perspective, and you can't say, well, you would have not liked to be the one in the middle. Yes, but that's also what it takes when you side from the side of fascism or Nazism, and then you complain because they bomb your house. It's pretty stupid in the first place. And that's where, civilization progresses and stupid people fortunately die. Because that's what we need to improve our civilization. Right? Because it's that same craziness we were talking about before we started World War II. And nobody can deny that. But the whole thing here must be very, very clear, because otherwise everybody can say whatever they like. Every country in the world constantly kills people. At this very single moment, your country, wherever you come from, is killing someone. Directly. Also indirectly. And much more indirectly. Right, but still because of you. Yeah, it is. Does this have anything to do with the way we are democratic? Right, of course it has. Of course it makes a lot of difference. Right, but it doesn't make us less democratic for this reason. Because if I have to blow terrorist brains out, I'm more than happy to pay people to do that for me. I mean, I'm actually proud to be part of a country that kills terrorists. I'm very, very happy. I would be happier if those terrorists had chosen a different way of life, had helping someone else. But at that point, yes, I'm happy that I belong to a polity that has killed terrorists. It makes me proud, even if I didn't do anything about that. But it makes me proud in the sense that it makes me happy about living in a country that is based on such principles. And to me, it's a big deal. And naturally, there are also bad things that happen in my country, like in any others. But that, as a citizen of this country, I have to take care of that equally, and that's called moral responsibility. So once again, just stating the thing that guy killed, I don't know, more or less, doesn't mean anything by itself. There's always a context, right? And also, I don't know how we got to this point, but oh yes, because of the, we were talking about the responsibility that the elites bear. Yeah, so don't think that even in this regard, even criminal governments like Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union actually were not crushed in their elites by the burden of what they had been doing. Right? Don't think that, humanly speaking, it works in a fashion for which you can dehumanize that person to say, oh, well, that's just a psychopath. It doesn't feel like, remorse. There were psychopaths in this regard, but the overwhelming majority was not. And these were people who saw and who witnessed some of the greatest atrocity in the history of mankind. Well, of course, you can put minus China in general into the equation. I mean, every single criminal you can think of, and realizing that this had a weight, that this brought hatred, that this brought retaliations, right? That this brings it even against someone else, that entails that this can't just happen because, once again, we're dealing with monsters. We're dealing with human beings. Dehumanizing human beings is probably one of the most stupid and therefore anti-human thing you can do ever. Because if you think that, I don't know, things like Nazi Germany happened because, I don't know, the Nazis were not humans, you are directly or directly responsible for causing such movements to kind of rise again. Because you simply don't understand why that happened, and that could have been you easily. Because if you had been born in there, you would have thought the same identical things. And this would have not made you justified for those things, right? So let's also cut out the crap of, no, those were all poor soldiers sent to the front for their homeland. Garbage, bullshit, of the lowest quality, by the way. These people were completely responsible for what happened. And that's exactly because they would have been killed otherwise, that they preferred not to fight back, that they said, okay, someone else will be killed in my place, in my stead, even if they had not been in agreement with that, which in great part they were. And believe me, it's not just because they were Nazis. You can find easily in many other countries also those who actually liberated Europe at the time, full of racist people, because it was actually normal at the time. But still, it made a difference to fight Nazi fascist oppression than not doing that, or oppressing the eastern half of Europe under Soviet hegemony for 50 years. That's another great deal. The life of hundreds of millions of people ruined. Right, and there was someone who wanted to nuke Moscow at the time in 1945, and who knows, right? But the point is exactly this, is that you always have to contemplate this, because you can't take that out of the equation. This is the sap of Clausewitzian theory, that pretending that these things do not exist, because we just stick to the ideal and to the wishful thinking, because we must be good and nice, and denying the existence of this reality is criminal, because it is literally what has made countless genocides happening all around the world, still happening, because nobody gives a damn. Because people are fundamentally ignorant about their own country, radically. Like, there is not a single country in the world that can claim that its population, on average, is minimally educated about their own history. No country, not even gets close to that. Leaving aside the history of other peoples, right? So, this is an enormous deal for a civilization, right? You can't build a sound civilization if you don't feel of this degree of complexity and of potentially disruptive power without knowing these things. And we are essentially evolving like that. We got lucky during the Cold War. Because during the Cold War, it could have happened very, very easily. We went one step away from pushing the button in 1984, right? Nuclear holocaust. For us Europeans first, then it would have gone for the Soviets and the United States. And we got pretty lucky. It didn't happen. We got dramatically close to it. Once again, there is nothing deterministic in here. It's not a matter of instinct of survival. It's really about realizing why it didn't happen. And if you don't study history, I'm afraid you can't answer that question. So this is an enormous deal. An enormous deal. And that's why I make these videos about von Clausewitz, because if you don't get this, where can you go? I mean, how can you feel free even, or powerful as an individual? But anyhow, von Clausewitz here is stressing now the importance also of sufferance. I mean, the idea that all these things pass through a sacrifice, right? It says, but it is impossible to realize all this in its full force without a foretaste of it by experience. He who only knows war from books or the drill ground cannot realize the whole effect of this counterpoise in action. We beg him, therefore, to accept from us on faith and trust all that he is unable to supply from any personal experience of his own. This is very important. Von Clausewitz stresses this rightfully, because this is probably one of the most widely overlooked thing ever. It is how much it costs to achieve all this. Right? If you haven't served, if you haven't fought, you cannot understand what it means, the crushing weight of just a march in enemy territory, of combat, and even more, all the responsibility that a general has on its shoulders. So whoever thinks that this does not exist, that it's an easy game, that there were at least people said, soldiers were monsters in general because they went out there to just, I don't know, kill babies or things like this. Once again, go ask the guys who stormed the beaches of Normandy what they had gone there for and what the price they paid. But even if it was the Vietnam War, right? You can't judge the war if you don't study its context. The Vietnam War could have been even won, which is a very unpopular opinion as far as I know, even in the United States today. But yeah, it was feasible. And I'm not talking even about enormous force in that regard, but just enough, as von Clausewitz says. It was technically possible. We have no certainty, because nobody has, and that's what the same Vom Kriege tells us, but still there were lots of other things could be done better. Not just strategically, simply also politically, at some level. And I promise we will make a video about that specifically. But just for saying that, there is always someone who has to bear a gun to take care of that. Because if there wasn't, we would lose a fundamental option of our political freedom. You can't conceive politics without violence within it. Because without that, you couldn't even resist tyranny or oppression. Resistance would have no value. And I can assure you, I wake up every day in my life thanking God or whoever for him in this regard, the people who actually did this and made it possible, that I live in a country that had its own resistance against tyranny and that won this war, right? And that it doesn't have to be given for granted, right? Because there was someone within the same country who was fighting for the exact opposite of that. So the fact that I can talk freely here, that I can study what I want, that I can go largely around my country and the rest of Europe and the rest of the greatest part of the world, is something that I will never give for granted, even if I was born like, yeah, I mean, technically we're still the Soviet Union, but it was crumbling to pieces. But I mean, I've always, lived in a mindset, in a frame, aside from being from the other side of Europe, but also living with this clear Western democratic Atlantic frame that makes me, that builds up a great part of who I think I am also identically in terms of beliefs, political beliefs, etc. Because this is not for granted, right? And the great danger is the very last generations are taking this for granted because they have not seen the suffering that they have not seen the price this cost. My grandparents told me about that. my parents are old enough to remember even parts of the destruction after the war. But when you have your house bombed, or you're risking your life, you're seeing people next to you being gunned down, being shot, being executed. When you have to hide in the mountains to escape deportation, when you have these are all things that already my grandparents lived through, right? And that I could see from their eyes, even if I know nothing directly from it, but I could see from their eyes when we were telling these stories. They were different people from the one I am, because and were better people from the one I am under that point of view, because they lived through things that made them consider deeply what the value of, more deeply than we do today, what the matter of human life and freedom and responsibility that also passes through the exercise of violence, of discipline, of deterrence, right? So once again, we should be humble about things we don't know, and we should make an effort, therefore, to understand them as much as we can. And von Clausewitz here even asks for this leap of faith, which he never does, right? Because he demonstrates everything, right? This is the first time we meet von Clausewitz telling us, look, I tell you like that this is the case. That is, you cannot understand what are the deprivations and the sufferings and the horror that means to employ the military option. But believe me, take it from, like, believe me on fate, right? Accept it from me on fate, and that you cannot understand it until you're not in it, right? And this is wild, because if you really experienced that, you would know how wild that is. Much wilder than you think or expect. I'm sure some of my audience actually knows about this stuff, because it's been, I don't know, out there, has fought, has suffered, has paid his tribute, and I believe it. I believe von Clausewitz in this. And it's important because he stresses, even if you read the stuff from books or drill grounds, right, you don't know about that. That is, even if you study a lifetime warfare, you will not know it. You will not understand it fully. And what the reason why von Clausewitz writes this is not just the broader, responsibility point that he makes, implicitly in the work, but it's also because he's trying here to make us understand how these factors count in a strategic analysis. That is, you cannot forget about this if you're trying to think what were the factors essentially were driving these people. You can't assess, like, in fact, the greatness of Frederick II if you don't realize what's the devastating picture that emerges from the 1760 campaign of the sufferings of this army and his commander. So this is particularly important. Then basically this chapter is actually very, very short, and we will finish it next time. And von Clausewitz concludes this part saying, this illustration is intended to give more clearness to the course of our ideas. In closing this chapter, we will only briefly observe that in our exposition of strategy we shall describe those separate subjects which appeared to us the most important, whether of moral or material nature, then proceed from the simple to the complex, and conclude it with the interconnection of the whole act of war, in other words, with the plan of for a war or campaign, right? So alright, but we will see next time what the stuff is. But I think today's video was important, right? Because I had actually stopped from some time to actually reflect on these issues, also in historical examples, but sometimes I'm brutally remembered by von Clausewitz how a huge deal this whole thing we discussed today really is, right? We can't be forgetful about the stuff. We can't, let's say, simply dismiss or remain in, insensitive or simply careless about this all. And what this is, once again, what unfortunately we do, generally speaking, as countries, as people, right? There is a great deal of forgetfulness of the very foundament of such, of the responsibility we constantly invoke. And it does pass through this better understanding of warfare. And this is very difficult to understand. Remember, I was presenting introduction to my thesis to my tutor, and there would be, I was talking about the stuff, and she doesn't know von Clausewitz, and it was not very important, but it was just to understand. She asked me at some point, would you think that, there is this low responsibility, because I was complaining about the fact that there are a few military historical studies, at least in my country, and that this is a symptom of a broader lack of political and civic education and stuff. And the reason she asked me why, because they don't study war. And from that question, I didn't answer because I told her, I actually said yes, but she wouldn't. I think she wouldn't understand, because objectively, even if you study a lifetime history and you don't pass through these realizations, it's very, very easy to get lost, to build a picture that gets ideologically polarized towards one side, right? And what von Clausewitz is simply saying here is that you have to judge every situation on the basis of what happens, right? You can't take a standard approach to every single problem. You can't think, now I follow this philosophy, therefore I will make it. In fact, von Clausewitz's work is not even a philosophy, right? If it is, it could be a natural philosophy, even a scientific treatise in some ways, because this is really stupid car alarm out of the window, is really showing you the reality on the base of physical principles, right? It's not a matter. Today we found the exception to this rule. Like, take it on faith, from von Clausewitz on faith. You can understand how tough the deprivations of a soldier can suffer, or a general can suffer during a campaign are, really. But you must make this effort of believing him. But all the rest is built through scientific evidence. It's built on step by step since the beginning. This logical chain, that's the reason why you can't simply read von Clausewitz or cherry picking its content just when you want to quote something, because if you don't frame it in its context, it will lose a value, right? And especially the whole message of the work will lose a value. It will not be fundamentally valid. You would understand just a part of it, but you don't understand once again where is it going. So I think this can be enough for today, and I think we can finish here. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.